think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain lies this random pattern generator. You will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
Hello and welcome. In the last episode, I talked about some of the negative experiences I had had with spirits years ago. But I also made contact with two benevolent spirit people in addition to my guide who, over time, became good friends and allies. For example, years later, one of them helped to cure me of a very painful medical problem, but that's a story for another episode. I'll go into detail on that one later. I should stress that I did not make initial contact with them by using the board. They came through to me via my spirit guide, and would communicate with me in the same way, moving my arm up for yes and down for no. Now, I won't say their names here, out of respect for them. Names are very important to how spirits seem to operate. I will say that they are human women, though they are not spirit people who had passed on after living a physical life. Those spirit people exist, and I've met many of them since then, but there are also spirits who have not had a physical incarnation. They can be in the form of traditional humans, as the two spirit women I'm talking about are, though there are as many different kinds of spirit beings as there are different species of animal in the world, perhaps even more. Attempting any sort of complete and precise taxonomy of types of spirit beings is an utterly impossible task, at least in our present reality. But given that, I will still use certain terms to refer to different types of non-physical life. Though it's tempting to use the word ghost for spirits who are physical people who have died, it is an offensive and laughable word to them. From this point on, I will refer to spirits who were physical people who have died as human spirits, even though there are other spirits who are indistinguishable from human spirits, even though they never lived as physical people. Other spirits I will simply call spirits, even though this category includes countless different types of beings. Now, there is a third group which I should designate. This group is distinguished from the previous two because of their nature and abilities rather than their origin, which can be drastically different from individual to individual, or from species to species if you want to see it that way. I will refer to this group as others. Simply trying to define or describe this category of beings will have to wait for another episode, as they are a very different bunch. I can think of no person, be they a ufologist, paranormal investigator, astral projector, remote viewer, occult practitioner, or indigenous shaman, who has ever been able to fully understand and define these beings. Even if they, like myself, have communicated with them or have even counted on one of them as an ally, they still elude full comprehension. I'm going to put further discussion of these others, and the fact that I've discerned even more categories on the back burner, and focus on spirits for now. After the news segment, I'll talk about what I've learned from them about themselves and their world. And now the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
I'll start with a collection of strange events from Argentina. On the 30th of September, 1964, in Comodoro Rivadavia, a man saw UFOs descend into the sea and later saw luminous objects emerge and fly off. On the 14th of October, in 1968, in Correa near Rosario, a rancher discovered a dead cow near 7 burned circular patches of grass. A few days later, fungi the size of basketballs were growing there. Neighbors saw strange lights in the sky around the date of the cow's death. On the 18th of March, 1966, near Deseade, a farmer saw a cigar-shaped UFO that was about 70 feet long. It was chugging along, giving off gray smoke, and then it crashed into the sea and sank. In February of 1960, in Golfo Nuevo, the Argentine Navy pursued unidentified underwater objects for over 15 days. In April 1957, near Pajas Blancas Airport in Cordoba, a motorcyclist saw a UFO 60 feet wide hovering ahead of him and hid in a ditch. An entity in a diver's suit came and fetched the witness into the UFO, then took him back, placing his hand on the man's shoulder in farewell. On the 31st of May 1971, in Pinamar Coast, Buenos Aires, a man saw a rotating UFO emerge from the ocean and follow him for a short distance before climbing out of sight. On the 17th of January 1965, in Puerto Garibaldi, a kind of foil or tinsel-like substance fell from the sky. On August 20th of 1957, in Quilino, An Air Force man saw a UFO and was unable to draw his revolver. A voice from the UFO told him in Spanish not to be afraid and that they had bases in the Salta region, and that they were here to warn people of dangers of atomic energy. On the 4th of October in 1965 in Salta, school children saw small green entities which tried to catch them. In the early 1960s in the Gulf of San Matías, strange luminous craft were often seen entering and leaving the sea. In March of 1984 in Santa Fe, there was poltergeist activity with showers of stones and voices which included screaming. In June 1950 in Tierra del Fuego, a man walking along the coast saw an oval-shaped UFO emerge from the sea and disappear over land, and a fortnight later, near Santa Cruz, he saw a similar event. All right, now we're leaving Argentina and going to Nashville, Tennessee, where on January 24th, 1891, snowflakes reportedly the size of saucers fell. That's from Monthly Weather Review from 1915. It also says that in Montana, in the winter of 1887, snowflakes that were 15 inches across and 8 inches thick fell. In the Yearbook of Facts, number 273 from 1861, it is said that on December 28th, 1860, at about 7 a.m., in the northwest part of Siena, a reddish rain fell copiously for 2 hours. It also says that a second red shower fell at 11 o'clock, and 3 days later, the red rain fell again, and the next day after that, another red rain fell. And each fall occurred in exactly the same quarter of town. Well, it sounds like maybe somebody was doing some kind of a crazily botched rain dance. In the Annual Register, number 687 from 1821, it says that on the 13th of August in 1819, something had fallen from the sky at Amherst, Massachusetts. It had been examined and described by Professor Graves, formerly lecturer at Dartmouth College. It was an object that had upon it a nap, similar to that of milled cloth. Upon removing this nap, a buff-colored, pulpy substance was found. It had an offensive odor, and upon exposure to the air, turned to a vivid red. This thing was said to have fallen with a brilliant light. Now here's a different account of the same event, this one from the American Journal of Science, number 1-2-335. It's the account of Professor Graves' accountant, communicated by Professor Dewey. That upon the evening of August 13th, 1819, a light was seen in Amherst, a falling object as well, and then a sound as if an explosion. In the home of Professor Dewey, this light was reflected upon a wall of a room in which were several members of his family. The next morning, in Professor Dewey's front yard, in what is said to have been the only position from which the light that had been seen in the room the night before could have been reflected, was found a substance, quote, unlike anything before observed by anyone who saw it, end quote. It was a bowl-shaped object about 8 inches in diameter and 1 inch thick, bright, buff-colored, and having upon it a fine nap. Upon removing this covering, a buff-colored, pulpy substance of the consistency of soft soap was found, quote, of an offensive, suffocating smell, end quote. A few minutes of exposure to the air changed the buff color to a, quote, livid color resembling venous blood, end quote. It absorbed moisture quickly from the air and liquefied. In 1870, at Mount Washington, New Hampshire, a very strange object was photographed. On top of the mountain is a weather observatory where some of the world's highest winds have been recorded. And in 1870, photographic equipment was installed at the facility to capture cloud formations. The newly installed camera produced an extremely interesting image in stereo format of an unknown flying object. Because there were no planes in the air during that era, what we have here is a UFO. The image shows what appears to be a cigar-shaped object. The stereo image was registered by Clow and Kimball in 1871. Often called the oldest UFO photograph ever taken, it was the subject of a bidding war on eBay in 2002. When finally the photo was purchased for $385 by Samuel M. Sherman, the president of Independent International Pictures Corps. At 2:25 a.m. on the 25th of February, 1942, alarm sirens blared out across Los Angeles. People fell out of their beds in fear, for it was only a few months since the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. They knew that the sirens were to be used in the face of another attack. The anxious and terrified inhabitants were told that a blackout was being enforced across the city, after strange flying objects had been spotted both on radar and moving through the sky at high speed above the sleeping populace. Searchlights probed the heavens, and at 3:16 a.m., anti-aircraft guns opened fire on several red or silver-plated objects coming in from the ocean at high speed and flying in formation. Witnesses saw in horror that they were untouched by the barrage of anti-aircraft artillery salvos. According to contemporary reports, this large object was hit by many anti-aircraft projectiles without apparently taking on any damage. It eventually disappeared into the night sky leaving Los Angeles witnesses agog, and the story has passed in the UFO legend as one of the most famous incidents of the 20th century. On the morning of November 2nd, 1885, in Scutari, Turkey, a luminous object circled the harbor, illuminated the whole town as a bluish-green flame, made several circles above the ferryboat pier, and then plunged into the sea. On November 12, 1887, at 2400 hours, at Cape Race in the Atlantic Ocean, a huge sphere of fire was observed rising out of the ocean by witnesses aboard the Siberian. It rose to an altitude of 16 meters, flew against the wind, and came close to the ship, then dashed off towards the southeast. In 1896, in the Swiss Alps, author Aleister Crowley was walking in the mountains when he suddenly saw two little men. He made a gesture to them, but they did not seem to pay attention and disappeared among the rocks. On March 26, 1897, in Sioux City, Iowa, a Robert Hibbard was caught by an anchor dropped from an unknown flying machine 22 kilometers north of the town. He was dragged over 10 meters and fell as his clothes were torn. On March 28, 1897, at 22:30 hours, in Omaha, Nebraska, the majority of the population observed an object arriving from the southeast. It looked like a huge light, flew northwestward slowly, and came to a low altitude. A crowd gathered at the street corner to watch it. A street corner. I imagine they have more than one street corner in Omaha. On April 1st, 1897, does that mean we already can't trust this one? At 2100 hours in Everest, Kansas, the whole town saw an object fly under the cloud ceiling. It came down slowly, then flew away very fast to the southeast. When directly over the town, it swept the ground with its powerful light. It was seen to rise up at fantastic speed until barely discernible, then to come down again and sweep low over the witnesses. At one point, it remained stationary for 5 minutes at the edge of a low cloud, which it illuminated. All could clearly see the silhouette of the craft. On Sunday, October 12, 1958, Ray Kerr of McKinleyville, California, was near Bluff Creek when he saw what he described as an upright man with swinging long, hairy arms. Quote, "It happened so fast, it's kind of hard to give a really close description, but it was covered with hair. It had no clothes. It looked 8 to 10 feet tall to me." Roy Wallace said he had seen a similar creature a short time earlier. It was hairy, walked stooped over, had long dangling arms, and was 4 feet across the shoulders. The mutilated bodies of 4 dogs were found in the area by Curtis Mitchell, an Indian, Native American, por favor, on the evening of Kerr's sighting. Quote, "They looked as if they had been ripped apart," he said. Quote, "One of them had apparently been slammed against a tree. The bodies were still warm when they were discovered off the Elk River Road, about 5 miles south of Eureka, California," end quote. On Saturday night, November 8, 1958, Charles Wetzel was driving home in Riverside, California. As he neared the point where North Main Street crosses the Santa Ana River, something leapt in front of his car. Quote, "It had a round, scarecrowish head," he said, "like something out of Halloween." Something out of Halloween? The movie? Was it wearing a bad William Shatner mask? Anyway, it wasn't human. It had a longer arm than anything I'd ever seen. When it saw me in the car, it reached all the way back to the windshield and began clawing at me. It didn't have any ears. The face was all round. The eyes were shining like something fluorescent, and it had a protuberant mouth. It was scaly like leaves," end quote. Wetzel reached for the .22 pistol he carried in the car and stomped on the gas. The thing fell back from the car and it gurgled. The noise it made didn't sound human. Quote, "I think I hit it. I heard something hit the pan under the car," end quote. There were long sweeping scratches on his windshield, but nothing was found at the site. The next night, a 6-foot-tall black thing leaped out of the bushes near the Wetzel site and frightened another motorist. The Wetzel story was widely circulated by the wire services and has become a monster classic. At some point in time in the Hoopa Valley, a resident known only as Peters was walking home in the late evening, and he saw a strange creature jump out, utter a surprised grunt, jump a 5-foot fence in one agile leap, and disappear into the darkness. It was not a bear, appeared not too much taller than a man, but was of tremendous width. In July 1966, in a forest outside of San Diego, California, 5 witnesses reported a tall, hairy creature that they discovered ransacking their car while they were picnicking. It growled and ran off, they said, hiding behind a tree and springing at them as they later drove past. It tried to reach into the window of the car, they claimed. Further on, they saw another tall figure sitting by the side of the road, apparently watching them go by rather nonchalantly. They said these beings were covered with reddish hair and were well over 6 feet tall. And they were not bears or other known animals. Late in July 1966, near Little Creek outside of Fontana, California, two frightened teenage girls reported that they had been in a car when a bush beast suddenly stood up behind their vehicle. They described it as being 7 feet tall, with brown hair and covered with moss and slime. Must be another Grateful Dead roadie. Their report kicked off a monster epidemic, and over 250 people, most of them armed to the teeth, poured into the area on a massive monster hunt. The Bernardino County Sheriff's Office said that amateur bush beast hunters were swarming nightly over the barren foothills, filling the night with wild gunfire. The slime-covered thing got away. Fontana is only about 20 miles north of Riverside, site of the 1958 Wetzel sighting. In July 1968, near Borrego Springs, California, a treasure hunter, Harold Lancaster, was prospecting in the Borrego Sink when he saw an ape man. Quote, I was camped up on a mesa one morning when I saw a man walking in the desert, Lancaster reported. The figure came closer. I thought it was another prospector, and I picked up my binoculars and saw the strangest sight of my life. It was a real giant ape man. Lancaster fired his .22 pistol in the air. I was afraid the beast might get too close, he said. The Sandman jumped a good 3 feet off the ground when the sounds of the shots reached him. He turned his head, looked toward me, and then he took off running in the other direction. And now some strange reports from November of 1966 that have a bit in common. On November 17th, 1966, a teenage boy on Route 7 near Cheshire, Ohio, saw a gray man-shaped creature with red eyes and a 10-foot wingspread pursuing his car. On November 18th, 1966, two firemen in the TNT area of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, saw a giant winged creature with red eyes. On November 20th, 1966, 6 teenagers at Campbell's Creek, West Virginia, saw a gray man-sized creature with red eyes. On November 24th, 1966, 2 adults and 2 children at Point Pleasant, West Virginia, saw a giant flying creature with red eyes. On November 25th, 1966, a male adult and on the highway passing the TNT area of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, saw a gray man-like being with red eyes and a 10-foot wingspread pursuing his car. In the mid-1970s, while driving one night along the long, desolate road between Port Hedland and Broome in Western Australia that had been regularly traversed for many years, a long-distance lorry driver suddenly saw a group of small, naked, dark-skinned people run across the road in front of him, clearly illuminated by his truck's powerful headlamps. Convinced that they were not simply Aborigine children, he was too disturbed by what he had seen to stop and investigate. He had never seen anything like them before and has not seen them again. In 1956, while sitting around a campfire one evening in Western Australia's Shark Bay area, with several other work hands of mixed blood, in other words, of mixed Aborigine and Malay background, a 16-year-old youth was nudged by one of his companions, who pointed to the other side of the fire. There, 2 work hands were communicating with a very little old man, no more than 4 feet tall, with dark, shriveled skin. The youth was later informed that this small, wizened being belonged to a group who periodically turned up from parts unknown in search of sugar and flour. The area's pearl fishermen of Malay extraction were reputedly terrified of these little people, refusing to spend the night alone on any part of the Shark Bay coast where they might live. In I, the Aboriginal, from 1962, Douglas Lockwood documented the fascinating life of Waipuldanya, a full-blood Aboriginal of the Alawa tribe at Roper River in the Northern Territory, who became a medical orderly, acquiring citizenship and a quote-unquote white feller name, Philip Roberts. According to Waipuldanya and the elders of his tribe, a race of 3-foot-tall pygmies known as the Burjinjin inhabits the mountains north of the Roper River. They are said to be immensely strong. A Burjinjin can reputedly carry a bullock on his shoulders and crush a normal man's bones. Belief in the Burjinjin is not limited to the Roper vicinity either, for it extends east through the Anula and Garawa country into Queensland. Similarly, as recently as 1994, newspapers were carrying reports emanating from Queensland's rugged Carnarvon Gorge of little hairy humanoids called the Junjuddi. Known to the Aboriginals since the earliest times, but often glimpsed by Westerners too, they are just over 3 feet tall, with ape-like limbs but a human torso and an elongated head. Their tracks resemble those of normal children, and their cries sound like the cackling of chickens. As documented in Brisbane's Courier Mail from January 29, 1994, one of their most diligent authoritative seekers is Graham Walsh, a former Carnarvon National Parks and Wildlife officer who once spied fresh Junjuddi tracks near the backblocks at the headwaters of the Moronoa River. They were similar to those that a barefoot 5-year-old child would make. Another race of pygmies reported from Queensland is the Dindari, likened to small hairy people with red skin rather than brown. Mysterious pygmies are not confined to Australia. Small, furry humanoids have been occasionally reported from New Guinea, and the Fijian Islands are reputedly inhabited by a race of little people called the Vele. According to Constance Frederica Gordon Cummings' At Home in Fiji from 1882, the Kai Tholos, or Highlanders, believe these islands' Great Pine Forest to be frequented by, quote, tiny men called Vele with high conical heads. These carry small hand clubs, which they throw at all trespassers who go mad in consequence. End quote. On October 15, 1957, something very strange happened to Antonio Villas-Boas in São Francisco de Sales, Brazil. On 2 previous evenings, Villas-Boas, a 23-year-old farmer, and his brother had observed a strange light over their farm. Then, at 1 o'clock a.m., on this cold, clear, and starry night, Villas-Boas saw a red star that grew to a bright egg-shaped object with a rotating cupola. The object, which measured 35 feet long by about 23 feet wide, first hovered over his tractor, but as the object landed nearby on its tripod legs, the tractor engine died. Frightened, Villas-Boas quickly jumped off but was grabbed before he had run but a couple of steps. 4 beings then struggled with him and took him aboard the craft. The beings were about 5 feet tall. They wore a very tight-fitting suit made of a soft, thick, unevenly striped gray material that seemed to continue at the extremities as gloves and thick-soled shoes. The garment reached up to the neck, where it was connected to a helmet that hid everything except the being's small blue eyes visible through lens-like windows. 3 tubes emerged from the top of their tall helmets and ran down to their ribs, where the tubes entered the clothing. Their uniforms included a belt with breast strap as well as a breast badge or shield. After communicating among themselves in slowly emitted growls, the beings began to forcibly undress Villas-Boas. They then washed his body with something like a soft, moist sponge that spread a clear, thick liquid over his body. He was then led into another room through a door that was inscribed with strange lettering. He waited a long time in this room and became nauseous because of a sickening smoke that was pumped into it. Finally, the door opened and a naked woman walked in. She had blonde hair parted in the middle and blue eyes that were longer than they were wide and slanted outward. She had a straight nose, high cheeks, a pointed chin, and a wide face. Her lips were thin and her ears were small. She measured only about 4 feet 5 inches tall. It is assumed that, under their spacesuits, the other beings would have had a similar human-like appearance. Something I can add to the story that I read from another source is that he said that her body was the most beautiful female body he'd ever seen in his life. The woman embraced Villas-Boas, making clear exactly what she desired, and he obliged. Which means they had sex. It doesn't say that outright in this account, but that's what happened. Afterward, the space-suited beings came in and departed with the woman, but before she left, she pointed to her belly, smiled, and pointed at the sky. When his clothes were brought in, Villas-Boas dressed and was given a tour of the craft. Afterward, the being showed him a metal ladder and signaled that he go down it. Villas-Boas observed the craft take off. It was 5:30 in the morning.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out of you.
Now, something I learned from them is that the spirits, the ones who are not physical humans who have died, I'll refer to those as human spirits, that the spirits have more restrictions or limitations on their form than human spirits. By that, I mean that human spirits can alter their form and have more power and ability than spirits who are not physically embodied. As many spiritual traditions have asserted, physical embodiment is highly sought after by spirits, even by those who go on to live a painful life. Now, when I first made contact with the benevolent spirits I mentioned earlier, they seemed to be tied to certain objects in my apartment. They couldn't just follow me anywhere, like my guide does. If I wanted one of them to come with me somewhere, I would have to bring one of the objects they appeared to be tied to. Over time, I noticed that it seemed less like they were tethered to the object and more like they were merely using the object as a sort of window or portal. One day, I had the revelation that a symbol or sigil is, in and of itself, an object, so I decided to ask those benevolent spirits close to me if they could use my hand to draw out sigils which would be associated with them, so that I could, if I ever wanted to contact them away from my apartment, just draw out one of their sigils and they would be there then. This technique worked when I tested it, but what actually struck me more than that was how interesting and unique their sigils were. One of them made a very simple and elegant humanoid shape out of straight lines. This made sense as she was the spirit of precision and craftsmanship. I'll describe more about her later. The other one created an interesting symbol, which I figured out years later, actually. Represented the state I live in, with latitudinal and longitudinal lines zeroing in on the city I live in. Very interesting.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed and she went into an alternate dimension.
I'm going to read an article which was originally published on Sage Journals, which is journals.sagepub.com. The article is called The Physicalist Worldview as Neurotic Ego Defense Mechanism, and it was written by Bernardo Kastrup and published November 1st, 2016. Now, this article has an abstract, which is, for those who don't know, a basic summary of the point of the paper. It's something that is common in scientific papers. All right, and the abstract for this one is, the physicalist worldview is often portrayed as a dispassionate interpretation of reality motivated purely by observable facts. In this article, ideas of both depth and social psychology are used to show that this portrayal may not be accurate. Physicalism, whether it ultimately turns out to be philosophically correct or not, is hypothesized to be partly motivated by the neurotic endeavor to project onto the world attributes that help one avoid confronting unacknowledged aspects of one's own inner life. Moreover, contrary to what most people assume, physicalism creates an opportunity for the intellectual elites who develop and promote it to maintain a sense of meaning in their own lives through fluid compensation. However, because this compensatory strategy does not apply to a large segment of society, it creates a schism, with corresponding tensions, that may help explain the contemporary conflict between neo-atheism and religious belief. All right, and now the paper itself. A worldview is a narrative in terms of which we relate to ourselves and reality at large. It is a kind of cultural operating system that gives us tentative answers to foundational questions such as what are we, what is the nature of reality, what is the purpose of life, and so on. Although many different worldviews vie for dominance today, the academically endorsed physicalist narrative defines the mainstream, despite its many difficulties. This reigning worldview posits that physical entities outside consciousness are the building blocks of reality. Consciousness, in turn, is supposedly an epiphenomenon or emergent property of certain complex arrangements of these entities. As such, under physicalism, consciousness must be reducible to physical arrangements outside and independent of experience. Physicalism is often portrayed as a worldview that, in contrast to, for example, religion or spirituality, is based solely on objective facts. The present article, however, hypothesizes that the formative principles and motivations underpinning the physicalist narrative, whether it ultimately turns out to be philosophically correct or not, are partly subjective, reflecting neurotic ego defense maneuvers meant, as described by Valent in 1992, to, quote, protect the individual from painful emotions, ideas, and drives. This becomes clear when one lifts core concepts of depth psychology to the social and cultural spheres. However, as a mostly clinical approach, depth psychology requires some elaboration before being applied at a theoretical level. The modern understanding of depth psychology can be traced back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the works of Friedrich Myers, Pierre Janet, William James, Sigmund Freud, and Carl Jung. Its foundational inference is that the human psyche comprises two main parts, a conscious and an unconscious segment. The conscious segment of the psyche comprises experiences a person has introspective access to and can report. According to the analytical school of depth psychology, the ego is defined as the experiential center of this segment. And it is in this specific sense that I use the word ego throughout the present article. In contrast, the so-called unconscious segment of the psyche comprises mental contents the person has no introspective access to and cannot report. Nonetheless, depth psychologists assert that unconscious mental contents can and do influence the person's manifest thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Because the ability to report an experience is a metacognitive capacity on top of the experience itself, a more rigorous articulation of the difference between the conscious and unconscious segments of the psyche is this. Conscious mental contents are those a person both experiences and knows that he or she experiences them. Unconscious mental contents, on the other hand, are those the person either does not experience or does not know that he or she experiences them. In other words, conscious mental contents fall within the field of self-reflection and, therefore, can be reported, whereas unconscious mental contents escape this field and, therefore, cannot be reported. Indeed, the existence of mental contents that are experienced but cannot be reported, even to oneself, is now well established in neuroscience, which has prompted the emergence of so-called no-report paradigms. However, as clinical psychologists can only gauge consciousness based on what their patients report, anything outside the field of self-reflection is indistinguishable from true unconsciousness. This explains the somewhat inaccurate terminology choice of the founders of depth psychology. Some critics have questioned the existence of an unconscious segment of the psyche on philosophical grounds. However, recent empirical results in neuroscience show the presence of broad cognitive activity that individuals cannot report, but which nonetheless causally conditions the individual's manifest thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. Recent neuroimaging studies of the psychedelic state have also corroborated the depth psychological view that ego suppression, in the form of reduction of neural activity in the brain's default mode network, brings otherwise unconscious mental contents into awareness. On the basis of these empirical results, the core idea of depth psychology, that is, that a segment of the psyche that escapes self-reflective introspection can causally condition our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, cannot be dismissed. And because cultural narratives are the compound result of an aggregation of the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of individuals, depth psychological insights are valid starting points for an analysis of the psychological underpinnings of our culture's mainstream worldview. According to depth psychology, a neuroses is the expression of an inner psychic conflict caused by the ego's refusal to acknowledge, confront, and ultimately integrate unwanted effects arising from the unconscious. To keep these effects at bay, the ego uses a variety of defense mechanisms, among which are denial, distortion, disassociation, repression, and so on. A particularly common defense mechanism is projection, whereby one circumvents the need to confront ego-threatening forces within oneself by ascribing the corresponding attributes to the outer environment. As such, projections can be said to partly hijack and manipulate one's worldview in an attempt to prevent short-term suffering. My hypothesis is that, through projection, the physicalist worldview gives us permission to avoid confronting some of what we find disagreeable within ourselves. This can be achieved in a variety of subtle ways. For instance, we all have a sense of our own existence and identity. Lucid introspection reveals that the root of this sense is our consciousness, our capacity to be subjects of experience. After all, if we were not conscious, what could we know of ourselves? How could we even assert our own existence? Being conscious is what it means to be us. In an important sense, perhaps even the only important sense, we are first and foremost consciousness itself, the rest of our self-imaging arising afterward as thoughts and images constructed in consciousness. From this perspective, the physicalist narrative's attempt to reduce consciousness to physical entities outside subjectivity is counterintuitive, for it divorces the alleged nature of consciousness from our felt sense of identity. We do not feel as though we were a bunch of physical particles bouncing around inside our skull. Instead, we feel that we are the subjective space wherein our experiences unfold, including our ideas about physical particles. Hence, there is a sense in which the physicalist narrative can be said to project the felt essence of ourselves onto something distinctly other. According to it, we are not really here, grounded in our subjective sense of being, but somewhere over there, in an abstract world fundamentally beyond the felt concreteness of our inner lives. As such, the physicalist narrative entails an emptying out of what it means to be us, a kind of secular kenosis. "I am no ghost, just a shell," laments the art character Ann Lee, whose predicament is that of many of us in contemporary society. The kenosis entailed by the physicalist narrative can exonerate its proponents from responsibility for their choices and actions. Consider this passage by Sam Harris, quote, "Did I consciously choose coffee over tea? No, the choice was made for me by events in my brain that I could not inspect or influence," end quote. The projection of responsibility here is clear in the corresponding release described by Harris himself, quote, "Losing a belief in free will has not made me fatalistic. In fact, it has increased my feelings of freedom. My hopes, fears, and neuroses seem less personal," end quote. Indeed, under the ethos of such a worldview, there is no concrete reason for guilt or regret. For we allegedly are not what we experience ourselves to be. We are not responsible for what happens here because we are not, and never have been, really here. We are not ghosts in the machine, but ghosts conjured up by the machine. In the significant sense, we do not really exist. As a matter of fact, some proponents of the physicalist narrative go as far as to deny that consciousness exists. Quote, "Consciousness doesn't happen, it's a mistaken construct," end quote. These words of neuroscientist Michael Graziano should give anyone pause for thought. Here we have consciousness, whatever it may intrinsically be, denying that consciousness exists. Philosopher Daniel Dennett also claimed that consciousness is an illusion, a claim that seems to immediately contradict itself. After all, where do illusions occur if not in consciousness? By appealing to metaphysical abstractions fundamentally beyond experience, such denials of our felt selves achieve a form of deliverance somewhat analogous to religious absolution. Surprisingly, as we will later see, they even help restore a sense of meaningfulness in life following what I will call ontological trauma. The structure of these denials is fairly clear. First, consciousness weaves the conceptual notion that certain aspects of its own dynamics somehow exist outside itself. Then, it projects its own essence onto these aspects. The corresponding dislocation of identity is apparent, and its neurotic character easy to grasp, with an analogy. Imagine a painter who, having painted a self-portrait, points at it and declares himself to be the portrait. This, in essence, is what physicalists do, whether it is philosophically justifiable or not. Their consciousness conceptualizes self-portraits within itself. Sometimes these self-portraits take the form of electrical impulses and neurotransmitter releases in the brain. Other times, they take the shape of quantum transitions or potentials. Whatever the case, their consciousness always points to a conceptual entity it creates within itself and declares itself to be this entity. It dismisses its own primary first-person point of view in favor of an abstract third-person perspective. Consider Dennett's words, quote, "The way to answer these first-person point of view stumpers is to ignore the first-person point of view and examine what can be learned from the third-person point of view," end quote. The contempt for the subject of experience, the primary datum of existence and one's own felt identity, is palpable here, the kenosis nearly total. The physicalist narrative may also give us permission to carve out and dismiss, again through the kenosis of projection, the most difficult aspects of our inner lives, our felt emotions. According to it, the feeling of an emotion is the internal perception of an action program, triggered by certain stimuli. Although the action program itself is important insofar as it helps us survive and reproduce, the accompanying feeling of emotion is, in a sense, a mere side effect of the program's execution. For instance, the sight of another human being facing a predicament is a stimulus that triggers actions meant to help the victim and, consequently, increase the social cachet of the action taker. The feeling of compassion, in turn, is supposedly nothing but the inner perception of this evolutionary useful reactive schema. It allegedly has no primary or fundamental significance. Under such a narrative, it is easier to go into denial about our emotional lives when the going gets tough. We feel justified to dismiss or repress our traumas and demons, avoiding the often painful work of psychological integration. The physicalist narrative provides a foundation for rationalizing the choice of living an unexamined, superficial life. To a person desperate to avoid the specter of immediate and pungent suffering, the benefits of this stance may seem to far outweigh its potential long-term implications. Surprisingly, the physicalist narrative can even offer us reassurance about death. According to it, there is literally nothing to fear about death itself because it is allegedly the end of all experience, including the experiences of fear and pain. All of our problems and suffering are guaranteed to end at that point. The great and scary unknown of the experiential realm beyond physical existence vanishes in one fell swoop. The greatest angst of humankind is conquered. The psychological allure of this idea is powerful, yet most people do not seem to ever stop to consider it. We have come to take for granted the comfort that our mainstream worldview grants us. To sum it up, by denying our felt sense of existence and identity, the physicalist narrative creates an opportunity to clear the ego of ultimate responsibility. By denying the fundamental reality of emotions, it creates an opportunity to protect the ego from a confrontation with far more powerful forces. And by projecting our ontological essence onto ephemeral arrangements of matter, it creates an opportunity to protect the ego from what has historically been the greatest angst of humankind, the experiential unknown of the after-death state. It has been shown that religiosity can reflect a form of compensatory control. By believing that transcendent forces aligned with one's convictions govern the world, the ego avoids the anxiety associated with its own inability to overcome uncertainty. In this way, religiosity creates an opportunity for control by proxy. Although the ego cannot determine the course of nature, an external agency far superior to it is believed to do so in a way consistent with the ego's preferences. The ego's need to avoid anxiety by exerting control is thus indirectly fulfilled. Going beyond religiosity, the physicalist narrative enables a sense of direct egoic control over nature. Indeed, a recent empirical study has shown that, quote, believing that science is or will prospectively grant mastery of nature imbues individuals with the belief that they are in control of their lives, end quote. Of course, by associating itself with science, in a philosophically questionable move that is nonetheless widely accepted, the physicalist narrative has become the enabler and ontological foundation of this belief. And because direct control, the notion that one can personally steer or at least predict what is going to happen, is known to be a key contributor to mental well-being, it stands to reason that the allure of physicalism in this regard could potentially be even stronger than that of religious control by proxy. The opportunity for direct control offered by the physicalist narrative goes as far as conquering death itself. If consciousness is just an epiphenomenon or emergent property of physical arrangements outside experience, it becomes conceivable that, through smart engineering, we could create a means to upload our consciousness into more durable substrates such as silicon computers. Some physicalists even offer detailed roadmaps for achieving this. The possibility of eternal life thus seems to open up, provided that consciousness can be instantiated in a computer by programming the computer with the patterns of information flow found in a person's brain. This, however, is premised on the notion that a simulation of a mental phenomenon is equivalent in essence to the phenomenon itself. There are many compelling arguments against this notion of philosophy of mind, the most well-known of which is perhaps John Searle's. To gain some intuition about what these arguments generally entail, consider this. Do we have any reason to believe that, by performing a perfectly accurate simulation of kidney function in a computer, the computer will begin urinating on its desk? Clearly not. There is an essential difference between a computer simulation and the phenomenon it simulates. They are not the same thing, no matter how accurate the simulation. Yet, those hoping to upload consciousness under the physicalist narrative seem to have become so engrossed in abstraction that they lose touch with basic intuitions of plausibility. The neurosis is, in this essence, comparable with religious dogma. Although both the religious and physicalist narratives create an opportunity for conquering death, their Promethean door to immortality opened by physicalism invests the ego, not deities, with the power to control transcendence through technology. This is seductively more direct, its only weakness, from a psychological standpoint, being that it is promissory. At present, nobody has ever managed to upload consciousness. Yet, some popular physicalist authors argue that consciousness uploading may be achievable still in our own lifetime, which actualizes the potential allure of their worldview. As seen in the ego protection through projection section and this section, the implications of the physicalist narrative consistently help protect and invest the ego with authority. This is not to say that physicalism is entirely motivated by neurotic ego defense maneuvers, for there is a philosophical argument behind it that cannot be dismissed. Nonetheless, the question is whether it is plausible that physicalism's significant ego defense potential has not been, to some degree, an unexamined motivation for its development, promotion, and adoption. Meaning, in the sense of significance and purpose, is probably the greatest asset any human being can possess. Psychotherapist Viktor Frankl, who practiced and led groups while detained in a concentration camp during World War II, asserted that the will to meaning is the most dominant human drive, in contrast to Nietzsche's will to power and Freud's will to pleasure. Meaning is so powerful that, as Jung remarked, it, quote, makes a great many things endurable, perhaps everything, end quote. Philip K. Dick's alter ego, horse lover Fat, in the novel Valis, embodies the essence of this drive. Quote, Fat had no concept of enjoyment, he understood only meaning, end quote. Like Fat, many of us see meaning as a higher value than power or pleasure. Our motivation to live rests in there being meaning in our lives. Today, we need meaning more than ever, for, as Paul Tillich lucidly observed, the greatest anxieties of our culture are precisely those of doubt and meaninglessness. And here is where an argument is often made for the impartiality of physicalism. As a worldview that, by turning the universe into a mechanical contraption fueled by mere chance drains the meaning out of life, it cannot possibly be a neurotic ego defense mechanism, or so the argument goes. Instead, the physicalist narrative must represent a courageous admission by, quote, tough people who face the bleak facts, end quote, as Watts said in 1989. It must embody an objective assessment of reality, not an emotional, irrational, wish fulfillment maneuver akin to religion. Compelling as it may seem at first, this argument fails careful scrutiny, for its premise is false. Indeed, according to the meaning maintenance model of social psychology, which is perhaps better seen in the context of a broader theory of psychological defense, we can derive a sense of meaning from 4 different sources: self-esteem, closure, belonging, and symbolic immortality. In other words, we can find meaning in life through A, cultivating a feeling of personal worth, B, resolving doubts and ambiguities, C, being part of something bigger and longer lasting than ourselves, and D, leaving something of significance behind, such as professional achievements, in the form of which we can live on after physical death. A society's mainstream cultural narrative conditions how meaning can be derived from each of these 4 sources. The key idea behind the meaning maintenance model is that of fluid compensation as an ego defense mechanism. If one of the 4 sources of meaning is threatened, an individual will tend to automatically compensate by seeking extra meaning from the other 3 sources. For instance, threats to self-esteem may cause the individual to reaffirm his or her model of reality, thereby bolstering closure. As Van Tongeren and Green have shown, a transcendent source of meaning, such as religion, plays the same role in fluid compensation as the other four sources. For instance, individuals tend to reaffirm their religious beliefs following disruption to their meaning system in an effort to protect the latter. Van Tongeren's and Green's experiments have not only empirically substantiated the meaning maintenance model, they have also shown that even subliminal threats to meaning trigger fluid compensation, strongly indicating that the unconscious is integral to the process. With this as background, my suggestion is that the physicalist narrative, in addition to being a rational hypothesis for making sense of the world, may be an expression of fluid compensation by intellectual elites. In other words, instead of a threat to meaning, the physicalist narrative may actually reflect an attempt by these elites to protect and restore their sense of meaning through bolstering closure, self-esteem, and symbolic immortality. The disruption that may have originally led to this compensatory move occurred around the mid to late 19th century. Indeed, it was at that time that we lost our ability to spontaneously relate to religious myths without linear intellectual scrutiny. Quote, with Descartes and Kant, the philosophical relation between Christian belief and human rationality had grown ever more attenuated. By the late 19th century, with few exceptions, that relation was effectively absent, end quote, wrote Tarnas. The myths that had hitherto offered us meaning through the promise of literal immortality and metaphysical teleology became untenable. Taylor, who richly chronicled this historical transition, characterized the corresponding loss of meaning rather broadly and generally as a, quote, wide sense of malaise at the disenchanted world, a sense of it as flat, empty, end quote. He even hinted at fluid compensation when speaking of the, quote, multiform search for something within or beyond the world, which could compensate for the meaning lost with transcendence, end quote. While acknowledging that this generalized malaise was the matrix of what followed, I submit that a more specific, forceful, impersonal threat to meaning was necessary to mobilize the extraordinary level of academic and intellectual endorsement amassed by physicalism. After all, as Taylor himself described through what he called the Nova effect, the malaise in and by itself fostered not only physicalism, but also an explosion of myriad other worldviews. I hypothesize that a profound and disturbing change in the intellectual elite's understanding of the nature of their own being, that is, an ontological trauma, was the specific, forceful, and personal trigger that helped congeal the physicalist narrative. Having lost religion, the elites were left with the prospect of physical deterioration without the path to transcendence previously offered by an immortal soul. Hence, they were forced to face the inexorability of their own approaching death. As we know from terror management theory, mortality's salience is a formidable threat to meaning, empirically shown to motivate investment in palliative worldviews. Ontological trauma may have thus triggered fluid compensation and ultimately led to the intellectual elite's championing of the physicalist narrative. Indeed, many studies have shown that mortality salience leads to a heightened need for closure. This is fluid compensation in action. Notice also that the physicalist narrative is humanity's most significant attempt yet to achieve closure in our worldview. As multi-billion-dollar experiments like the Large Hadron Collider, whose primary purpose is to close the standard model of particle physics with no immediate practical applications, illustrate, physicalism embodies an unprecedented effort to produce a causally complete, unambiguous model of reality. Nothing else in millennia of preceding history has come anywhere near it. I suggest that this is not coincidental. The physicalist narrative may reflect the elite's ego's attempt to regain, through heightened closure, the meaning it lost along with religion. Moreover, other modalities of fluid compensation may be at play here as well. By distinguishing themselves as a segment of society uniquely capable to understand facts and concepts beyond the cognitive capacity of others, the scientists and academics who promote the physicalist narrative stand to gain in self-esteem. The cosmological scope of the scientific world they produce and leave behind upon their deaths can also be seen as a boost to symbolic immortality. Finally, recall Tillich's observation, doubt and meaninglessness anxiety dominate our culture's mindset. Is it humanly plausible that our mainstream narrative would have evolved to tackle only doubt and leave meaninglessness anxiety unaddressed? All in all, the physicalist narrative does not necessarily represent a net loss of meaning for the intellectual elites who produce and continue to promote it. The transcendent meaning lost along with religion may be compensated for by an increase in closure, self-esteem, and symbolic immortality. Unfortunately, however, this compensatory strategy cannot work for most ordinary people. The men and women on the streets do not have enough grasp of contemporary scientific theories to experience an increase in their sense of closure. Neither do they gain in self-esteem because they are not part of the distinguished elites. Finally, insofar as ordinary people do not produce scientific work of their own, no particular gain in symbolic immortality is to be expected either. In conclusion, the physicalist narrative may serve the egoic meaning needs of the intellectual elites who develop and promote it, but constitutes a significant threat to the sense of meaning of the average person on the streets. Perhaps for this reason, a large segment of society seeks meaning through alternative ontologies considered outdated and untenable by the intellectual elites, such as religious dualism. This creates a schism with corresponding tensions between different segments of society, which may help explain the contemporary conflict between neo-atheism and religious belief.
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
Now, I should point out that over time, I learned from these two spirits that they came to me because I already knew them in the spirit world. I was very surprised and somewhat confused to hear that I apparently already knew them in some other state of being. No, I thought, you live here in the physical world, then you die and move on to the spirit world, right? My spirit guide and contacts disagreed and said that physical people have spiritual states, that we really are spiritual people experiencing physical life. Now, some people are more connected to and aware of their spiritual states, and some exist in more levels of spiritual being than others. Some other people have unfortunately lost connection to their spiritual self to such a degree that they are essentially spiritually dead. When these people die, they do not continue on in a spiritual state. They merely return to the life stream, so to speak. In other words, they reincarnate without any karmic aspect or spiritual memory. While some may consider this to be an acceptable or even desirable fate, spirits consider this fate to be absolutely horrible. It's basically how you fail at life. To make things even more complex, some living beings reincarnate, yet retain their karma and spiritual memory, which is not the same fate at all, and is perfectly spiritually acceptable. If you are someone who has a connection to your spiritual state, you return to the so-called spirit world when you are in deep sleep, or when you are knocked out from anesthesia, or when your brain temporarily ceases to function, like in a near-death experience. These benevolent spirit contacts of mine say that I knew them already from my parallel life in the spirit world, which I would experience while I was in the deepest levels of sleep. All these things seemed very new and strange to me when I first heard about them from the spirits, but since then I have had all this information confirmed and corroborated by many different sources and spiritual traditions. As would be evidenced to me even further over the years, this shows that, at least, I am not completely crazy, that I am receiving the same information which countless others have received in their own ways throughout the ages. In the next episode, I will describe more about what I learned from them about the very complex and nuanced states of being we call the spirit worlds. Alright, have a nice day.
Not only is he like ruining my life, but with all this God shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears. I can interact with it.
Fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind is